This is Away Series 2, a podcast for anyone interested in a fresh approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. This is episode 2. In episode 1, we looked very briefly at the years leading up to the year in which the big book was published. I can't emphasize enough how important it is, when reading it, to keep the context of time at the front of your mind. We tend to hold previous generations to our standards. I think it's totally human to think, how could they not have known slavery was wrong or that women were equal? Don't get me started on the ill effect almost all Western religion has on the consideration of women as equals. My sense, however, is that plenty of people did know, that too often the hateful and ignorant had won. Fear-mongering was as good a tactic 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, as it is now. So it was the people who did get it on some level, even while society said otherwise, who fought incredible battles to end inequality. Of course, I don't put Bill, Bob, Jim, or any of the first 100A members in the hero category, and I refuse to put them on pedestals. Idolatry should never be a part of AA. They were men, normal men, who found a solution to their alcoholism and then decided to share it with anyone who would listen. It doesn't matter who has what theory about the evolution of their ideas. The fact is that they had them and they shared them. That's the biggest deal of all, in my opinion. They gave us an outline, a book of suggestions based on their experience. We should read it, I think, to understand our roots. It's a piece of writing that binds us all together. But it's not a Bible. It's not sacred. It's not a love letter from God. It's a book of suggestions written by people who were ecstatic to be free from the chains of addiction. And even if they had other ego-driven motives, they also wanted to help people. Those things are not mutually exclusive. And it's kind of what matters. So we continue that tradition. And because there isn't only one true way to do the steps, or even one true way to get and stay sober, we pass along our own experiences to others. Recently, I've been listening to the podcast Armchair Expert. And this week, I listened to Dax Shepard, the host of Armchair Expert, interview Dr. Phil. I don't know much about the doc, but they got to chatting about AA. Dax is a member who does not stay anonymous, and Dr. Phil is not an alcoholic, but in his own words, is a big fan of AA. And it's a big deal because he grew up with an alcoholic father. He goes on to explain why, and he gets right to the heart when he says, quote, "I don't think it's the only thing people need to do, but I think anytime you want to achieve something and you surround yourself with like-minded people, how could that not be good? If you want to change your life in any way whatever, and you surround yourself with people who want the same thing and want it for you, then that's got to be good. And experience is important. When you go to AA, you've got someone that's maybe 6 months ahead of you, maybe a year ahead of you, 2 years ahead of you. They can tell you where the potholes are. End quote. Right? That's the whole point. That's the brilliance. Anyway, sorry for the lengthy preamble. In this episode, we're going to look more specifically at the beginning of AA's timeline. In my experience, understanding the story and getting to know a little bit about the characters helped me to feel connected to AA in a new way. It also helped me to make my way through the yuckier parts of the big book. These are men, not saints. And a couple of women. Let's start by opening the book itself and going straight to the foreword to the second edition. For our purposes, this is the only foreword we'll examine. Unlike in Series 1, I won't always go page by page along with the book. I suggest reading the foreword to the second edition before continuing this episode so that you're at least a little familiar with it. Alrighty. It's in this foreword that the book first begins to talk about the development of AA. A lot of the story mentioned in this foreword is gone into in greater detail a little bit further along in the book. But I'm going to use this opening to give a rundown of the timeline so that when we hit the story again later, you're already familiar with the events and people who helped build AA. In America, as far back as 1774 and throughout the late 18th century, there is writing about the dangers of alcohol and a call for moderation in drinking known as temperance or teetotalism, also known as abstinence. The dangers of alcohol were clear to our founding fathers. Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, et al. Called for temperance. When Hamilton introduced an excise tax on spirits, the Whiskey Rebellion, as it was dubbed by farmers, was ferocious. In the early 1900s, the first sober houses were developed, the forerunners to today's rehabs, by Dr. Benjamin Rush. By 1830, the scourge of alcoholism was apparent to everyone. Quote, "The average American over the age of 15 consumed 3 times the contemporary rate of absolute alcohol consumption." 3 times over the age of 15. That's from the WalterWhitePapers.com, a narrative timeline. As is a lot of this information. And if you want to get into even more detail than I'm going into, definitely take a look at the Walter White Papers. There's a lot there. There was a call to action by leaders, and the temperance movement became one not of moderation, but of abstinence. Around the same time, a group of drinking buddies formed the first Abstinence Club. They called themselves the Washington Temperance Society. The requirements for membership were straightforward: a pledge of total abstinence and monthly dues equal to about $4 today, attendance at weekly meetings. It was at the meetings that members shared their stories of drinking and recovering. Sounds familiar, right? This small group became a much larger group known as the Washingtonians. Even Lincoln proclaimed the greatness of the group. They grew and grew and grew. And because membership was not limited to people with a desire to stop drinking, the group had members who only advocated for temperance, were teetotalers. Anyway, there are a lot of theories about the dissolution of the Washingtonians. Originally, they stayed neutral on religion and politics, but as the society grew and issues like abolition of slavery took front stage, there was not only some tension among the members of the group, but the interest in the greater society waned. I'd argue, and this is in big part based on the research done by Arthur S., which you'll find on the William White papers, that the most fundamental reason for their collapse was that they'd lost their primary purpose. One alcoholic sharing his experience with another. Little by little, the conversation about alcoholism grew and changed. It was in 1849 that the term alcoholic was coined by Dr. Magnus Huss. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, some of the most important characters in our story were born. Charles Towns, Bill Wilson's parents, William Silkworth, Daniel Buckman, Bob Smith, Anne Ripley, Roland Hazard III, T. Henry Williams, Henrietta Seiberling, Lois Burnham, and Ebby Thatcher, to name a few. When Bill was born on November 26, 1895, curing alcoholism was a growing area of business. I'm assuming no one is interested in every single detail of each of their lives as children, so I'm going to summarize some of what I see as the most important elements of the story. It's still got a lot of detail, but not all of it. So, Bill was born in 1895. In 1905, his father abandoned his family. His mother had been spending a lot of time with her sister before then because the relationship was quote-unquote stormy. Now, I don't have details on what that means, stormy, but if I were to take an educated guess, stormy and violent might be synonymous. After his father left, his mother made arrangements for Bill and his sister to live with their grandparents temporarily, but in 1906, the kids were told neither of their parents would be returning. By 1907, they were divorced, which was then a disgrace to both the divorcees and the family. Talk about feeling different or less than. 1909, Bill is sent to boarding school, and it's there in 1911 that he meets his lifetime best friend and the man who ultimately brings him the gift of sobriety, Ebby Thatcher. In 1912, while away at school, Bill learns of the death of his first true love and former day school mate, Bertha Bamford. By all accounts, this is a turning point in his life. He quickly goes from being class president and star football player to failing out of school. By 1913, Bill meets Lois and a romance begins to develop, but over the next few years. In the meantime, he's moved in with his mother in Massachusetts. He ultimately attended the Norwich Military Academy until he's suspended for an extreme quote-unquote hazing incident. I don't even know what that meant then. Hopefully it's not nearly as bad as what it means now. Drinking's already in his story, so I don't know. The male historians go out of their way to say that he was only a freshman onlooker. But by now you know my opinion of facts like that. No matter what, we all have bias. Also, you know that I think, even if it's true that he was just an onlooker, he was complicit. Anyway, Bill returns to Norwich after a full term off. In 1917, Germany enters into World War I, and Bill heads to officers' training. Bill and Lois marry quickly in 1918, when there are rumors that Bill will be sent abroad. He was. in mid-1918. But the war ended soon thereafter, and by 1919, he was home. It's when he's abroad, and we'll read this later, that he's at Winchester Cathedral. At this point in Bill's story, alcohol has taken on a pivotal role. But again, more on that when we actually read Bill's story. He and Lois lived with her father on Clinton Street in Brooklyn for most of 1919, and in 1920, they rented their own small place on State Street in Brooklyn, very near to her parents. And Bill was already burning bridges, losing jobs. In the early 20s, Bill and Lois were trying to have a baby, but ultimately it proved impossible. And they were denied adoption, actually by the same agency from which I was adopted, Spence Chapin, because of Bill's drinking. But that's something they only learned later. Let me just say, as an adopted child, phew! Drunk dad and long-suffering mom doesn't sound fun. Vows of abstinence from alcohol, of course never from other women, begin in the mid-20s and are never kept. In 1928, Bill finally gets a decent job on Wall Street, but by then the drinking is his first priority. After the crash in 1929, that job was lost. He was given another good job in Montreal, but was fired in 10 months for his drinking and violence. This cycle continues for years. He can barely hold jobs at all. He is in and out of detox, and his life is falling apart completely. It's not until December of 1934, on another visit to Towns Hospital, a hospital for the treatment of alcoholics, that we will look at in a little bit, that things start to change. When his childhood friend, Ebby Thatcher, comes to visit him. It's then that the story of AA itself really begins. But let's circle back to the history of some of the other players first. As you know, Dr. Bob Smith is one of the other founders of the program. He's also Bill's senior by about 6 years and had experienced a little more success in his life, by some standards. He met Anne in 1898 in his senior year at St. Johnsbury, and they remained a couple for the rest of his life, although they dated 17 years before they married. Dr. Bob heads to Dartmouth for undergrad, a school then notorious for its drinking culture. I'm not sure that's still true. After graduating, he spent 3 years wandering aimlessly, basically, through life, and finally, at 26 years old, enrolled in pre-med at the University of Michigan. As an aside here, listen to the podcast Dr. Death. Okay. It's not about Dr. Bob, but it's like, oh, so scary. 1907 is a bad year for Dr. Bob, getting into trouble all the time for drinking, and he doesn't ultimately graduate from medical school until 1910. By 1914, Bob had been hospitalized so many times for drinking that he went home to recover. And he didn't drink again for 5 years. In that period, he and Anne married. They adopted a daughter and had a son. In 1929, Dr. Bob's drinking heavily again. But he returns to study and ultimately become a proctologist surgeon. And while he's originally gainfully employed, his drinking and now barbiturate addiction make it difficult for any hospital to keep him on board. It's in May of 1935 that Bill and Bob first meet, and the first real meeting of AA takes place in Akron, Ohio. But we must again circle back to examine the events that ultimately led to that meeting. It's what you'll hear many people refer to as synchronicity in the rooms. And in Jungian terms, it is. but not necessarily supernatural. Remember, Jung believed in the idea of collective unconscious. That's really important. And I think it's what he meant by synchronicity in part. I'm also, and you know this if you listen to Series 1, not convinced that when he used the word spiritual, he meant supernatural or celestial, but rather a complete mental and emotional shift in way of thinking. As you know, I believe that can happen from within. I think that's probably enough for this episode. That's a lot of information to digest. We will move on to examine the other characters in this story and their lives in brief before that first meeting in Akron happens. And then hopefully continue in that same episode a little bit into AA's earliest days. After that, we'll start on the doctor's opinion. He is himself, Dr. William Silkworth, one of the most important characters to the story. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please email me or comment with questions, or if you think I've said something wrong, I'm happy to correct it. And as ever, I hope this reminds you that no matter what, there is a way.